All right, so I got a pretty massive update here for you guys on the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. So a couple of days ago, we were talking about that pretty successful counter-offensive by Ukrainian armed forces, sort of up in the northeastern region of the country, and we were basically wondering what Putin's response to this was going to be. There were a couple of different options on the table. I guess maybe he could have used that as an opportunity to draw down the war and sort of try to cut his losses. And then the other option was obviously for him to double down, which was, as we predicted, probably the more likely outcome, and it appears like we have finally gotten our answer, as Putin is now going to be apparently ramping up with a partial mobilization. So keep in mind, so far, Vladimir Putin has still been calling this a special military operation, and that's not just like a propaganda piece for him to use. It also has like actual, reverberating effects in terms of how many men they are able to send into the war, how much, resources they are able to dedicate to it. And so him now changing that to at least a partial mobilization of Russia's troops and resources, that's definitely a significant escalation from what we're seeing right now. So here from CNBC, they say Putin mobilizes 300,000 troops for the war in Ukraine and warns that he is not bluffing with a nuclear threat. So, okay, if you guys remember back at the start of this war, I'm pretty sure that the initial invasion force was only like 200,000 or so troops. So escalating that to mobilizing now 300,000 troops is definitely a pretty big jump there. Now, on top of that, we also still have the fact that, a lot of the initial losses and casualties from the Russian side during the early parts of this war were among some of the most prestigious members of the Russian military, some of their best fighters. And so now they're basically resorting to conscripting 300,000 troops to send to this war, and they are definitely not going to be of the same caliber as some of the initial invasion forces. But let's go ahead and get into some of the details here. They say Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday announced a partial military mobilization in Russia, putting the country's people and economy on a wartime footing as Moscow's invasion of Ukraine continues. They say in a rare pre-recorded televised announcement, Putin said that the West wants to destroy our country and claimed that the West had tried to turn Ukraine's people into cannon fodder, in comments translated by Reuters repeating earlier claims in which he has blamed Western nations for starting a proxy war with Russia. So a couple of different points here in terms of like how much of this is actually accurate in the narrative that Putin is using. First of all, blaming the West for starting this war, I think, is completely delusional. If anybody is to blame for starting this war in the first place, it's nobody except for Vladimir Putin. I mean, I think some people could make reasonable arguments in terms of like NATO sort of encroaching into places where they otherwise had previously promised that they wouldn't expand closer to Russia's territory, but that was not the cause of this war. Okay, the cause of this war was Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions, point blank period. Okay, so that part of it is 100% inaccurate, but the fact that this is a proxy war, as he is calling it, that part is accurate. I mean, we've heard from US politicians. I think it was Chris Murphy from Connecticut who basically did a Twitter thread and went out on the media and admitted that the US is thinking about this in terms of a proxy war. So that part of it is definitely true. You also have the added aspects here in terms of the role that the West has played in trying to put their thumb on the scale and pressure Ukraine to not engage with diplomatic talks with Russia. You had that trip from Boris Johnson, the previous UK Prime Minister, where he basically went to Ukraine and said that like the West is not done with this war. We want to use this as an opportunity to crush Russia as much as possible. And so, the part about the West trying to destroy Russia as a country, I think that part is at least partially true. I mean, definitely you have U.S. weapons manufacturers who have been profiting to the tune of billions of dollars throughout this war. That's an added, benefit for the U.S. National security state and the military-industrial complex. So I think that is probably factored into the decision making. But on top of that, I mean, we knew from the beginning of this, when we had people like Hillary Clinton going out on mainstream media outlets and basically just saying the quiet part out loud and saying, we are not even necessarily focusing as much on, the independence or the freedom for the Ukrainian people, and more so on an ability for the United States to use this as an opportunity to try to crush and pressure and back down one of our perceived political adversaries. So I think that this is like kind of a mixed message here from Vladimir Putin. Some of it is just obviously straight up propaganda and lies, and other points here I think have been backed up by what we've seen from Western politicians. But They continue saying that Putin said that mobilization events would begin on Wednesday without providing further details, aside from saying that he had ordered an increase in funding to boost Russia's weapons production, having committed and lost a large amount of weaponry during the conflict, which began late February. And keep in mind, I mean, with the amount of money that the United States and other Western European countries have given to Ukraine in both just like straight up aid and also military hardware directly, we have basically been giving them close to the entire amount of Russia's military budget in terms of the weaponry that we have been giving them. So I mean, the initial Russian military capacity, or the initial Ukrainian military capacity, has pretty much been wiped out at this point, and it is essentially at this point just the Western countries of the United States, the UK, a couple other ones like Germany, etc., that have been basically propping up the entirety of the Ukrainian military. And obviously that has been part of the main reason why they've been able to have this successful counteroffensive recently and continue to stay in this war as long as they have. But they continue saying that Putin confirmed that military reservists would be called up into active service, but insisted a wider conscription of Russian men of fighting age was not taking place. Of course, this is the word of Vladimir Putin, so take it with a grain of salt. He says, "I reiterate, we are talking about partial mobilization, that is, only citizens who are currently in the reserve will be subjected to conscription, and above all, those who served in the armed forces will have a certain military specialty and relevant experience." He says conscripts will obligatorily go through additional military training based on the experience of the special military operation before departing to the units. He said, according to the Associated Press translation, a little bit more details here. They say, in what was immediately greeted as an escalatory address, Putin also accused the West of engaging in nuclear blackmail against Russia and warned again that the country had lots of weapons to apply to what he said were Western threats, adding that he was not bluffing. They say that Putin has alluded to Russia's nuclear weaponry at various points during the conflict with Ukraine, but there are doubts over whether Moscow would actually resort to deploying such a weapon, with analysts saying that it could be tantamount to starting a third world war. And I think it definitely could be. I mean, obviously, depending on what, basically the Joe Biden administration would want to do with the response to that. He was actually asked about this in a recent, I think it was a 60 Minutes interview that he did, and basically said, Putin absolutely should not be using nuclear weapons, and, depending on the extent to which he decided to, escalate his attacks, that could drum up some sort of a direct Western response to that. So, yeah, that is a pretty big threat, although I wouldn't, count Putin out, as this article seems to be doing, in terms of downplaying the threat of him actually resorting to using, tactical nuclear weapons, which are sort of like the smaller scale ones. I definitely think that that is on the table. I mean, it's part of Russian military doctrine that if there is a threat to the Russian state or the government under Vladimir Putin's control, that they do reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. So I think that that threat is definitely on the table, especially as we continue to see basically this attempt by Western countries to put a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin. So you are kind of playing with fire there a little bit at least, but now we get a little bit more information in terms of what these conscriptions are looking like, as well as some protests that have been going on in response to this, because that was another factor that I talked about in my video the other day, where if you do start having this full-scale mobilization, or even this partial mobilization, which is what he's calling it, then you are going to significantly escalate the pushback that Vladimir Putin is going to be getting domestically within Russia, and that's pretty much exactly what we have seen recently. So here from CNN, they say Russia drafts anti-war protesters into military amid nationwide demonstrations, says a monitoring group. So honestly, let me just say up front, I don't really have any ability to fact check this specific monitoring group that is reporting this, but I'm just going to read out some of the details of what they're claiming here. But honestly, just at face value, regardless of whether or not this is true, it doesn't really make any sense to me in terms of why Vladimir Putin would be doing this to anti-war protesters, to go send them off to fight in a war, because it seems like those probably wouldn't be the best troops that you would want fighting on the front lines. But they give a little bit of details here, saying that more than 1,300 people were detained across Russia on Wednesday for participating in nationwide anti-war protests, with some directly conscripted into the military, according to a monitoring group, after leader Vladimir Putin announced this partial mobilization of citizens for his faltering invasion of Ukraine. They say images and video show police cracking down on demonstrators in multiple cities, with footage showing several protesters at a demonstration in central Moscow being carried away by the police and authorities in St. Petersburg, attempting to contain a crowd chanting "No mobilization" outside of, not even going to try to pronounce that, cathedral. but they say that police detained the protesters across 38 cities in Russia on Wednesday, according to figures released shortly after midnight by an independent monitoring group, OVD Info. And the group's spokesperson, Maria Kuznetsova, told CNN by phone that at least 4 police stations in Moscow, some of the protesters arrested by riot police were being drafted directly into Russia's military. So first of all, credit to these protesters for going out there and putting their bodies on the line to actually protest this ongoing imperial invasion from Vladimir Putin. But whether or not they're actually conscripting them into the war itself, I think if that's true, that makes absolutely no fucking sense from the perspective of the Russian military, because you're going to have a bunch of people who have openly voiced that they are anti-war, they are against this invasion. So not exactly sure how those would be your best troops to go fight in this war. I mean, maybe they would not be participating to the extent you want them to. Maybe they're going to push back if you do send them to the war. So doesn't really make any sense to me in terms of like a strategic approach for Vladimir Putin to decide to do that. We also had another interesting update here from both India and China, where during this recent meetup that they had, you had a little bit of pressure that was being applied on Vladimir Putin, or at least sort of rhetoric that was indicating that especially India's Narendra Modi is not really in favor of this investigation. So we got a quote here. He said, this era is not of war. Modi publicly asks Putin to end the Ukraine war, and that's a first. So this is a pretty much, a surprising update here in terms of the pushback that he's gotten from a little bit of China, a little bit of India. Now, obviously, on the flip side of that, they are still sort of like aiding Russia in terms of like, ramping up trade deals and importing oil and other resources and stuff like that. So, there is still definitely cooperation between India and China and Russia. But I think you do also kind of get this sense that even some of his like closest allies in the region are starting to just be like, listen, man, this war is not working out. This is not going to be effective long term for the security of the region. Obviously, Vladimir Putin intended from the outset of this war to have it done very quickly. He thought he was going to be able to depose of the Zelensky government and basically march into Kyiv within just a couple of days. And obviously now we're in, I don't know what, like month 6 or 7 of this war now. And it appears like they're basically at a stalemate, or if anything, we've seen, like we covered the other day, recent examples of Ukraine actually making successive pushbacks, and in the case of this northeastern counteroffensive that they launched, pushing Russian forces straight up back to the Russian borders. So, I mean, that's your update for today. I mean, obviously, we're going to have to see the consequences of what this partial mobilization of hundreds of thousands of troops is going to actually do on the battlefield for Russia. Again, a lot of these troops, I'm guessing, are not really going to be the most highly trained, not the most highly effective. You do have like NATO and US forces that are training Ukrainian troops. So, I think that in terms of like the quality of their actual troops, I think the Ukrainians as of right now probably have an advantage on that. But at the same time, we're still talking about Russia, which is obviously like one of the most powerful global militaries. And obviously, Vladimir Putin is not going to be backing down anytime soon, and so we're going to have to keep tracking with this war. Obviously this is going to be something that takes place over the next months, if not years, and doesn't really seem as of right now that there is any end in sight for this war. Doesn't seem like Zelensky, doesn't seem like Vladimir Putin want to come to the table and have any sort of diplomatic negotiations. So I'm sure that with this influx of troops, there's definitely going to be some offensive maneuvering by the Russian forces, probably down in the southern region by like Odessa all the way over to Crimea and the southeast region of the country as well. So I'll keep you guys updated if we get any more information or if we see some sort of a massive troop surge. But there's your update on the current state of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying